So I have the privilege of first introducing Matthew Visk, who is at the University of Cambridge. His paper is titled, "Was the Cross Absolutely Necessary? God's Twofold Righteousness in John Calvin." So would you please give Matthew a round of applause.
Thank you so much. There is a handout in the back for those of you who are interested, but it's supplemental and won't be necessary for the content of the paper. Penal substitutionary atonement is a theory of atonement that has often been associated with the theology of John Calvin. However, there has been a subtle, almost imperceptible change from the early Reformed theologians' doctrine of satisfaction and what is commonly thought of today as penal substitution. Language has shifted from satisfying justice to satisfying wrath, from Christ offering satisfaction to the Father being satisfied, and from Christ bearing our penalty to God punishing Christ. Consequently, some theologians insist that an orthodox understanding of penal substitution entails the absolute necessity of retributive punishment, claiming that God's wrath must be sated, and effectively condemn many of Protestantism's foundational theologians. This paper aims at retrieving aspects of John Calvin's doctrine of satisfaction which do not entail the absolute necessity of the incarnation or cross. Penal substitutionary atonement can be reduced to its simplest form as any explanation whereby Christ pays a penalty, penal, in humanity's stead, substitution. Theologian Oliver Crisp astutely points out that there are various existing versions of penal substitution when he writes, "I take it that penal substitution is that family of views of the atonement according to which Christ's atoning work on the cross consists in his acting as a penal substitute, taking upon himself the penal consequences of my sin and being punished for that sin in place of the sinner." This broad definition, however, is not always what authors and theologians understand when they refer to penal substitution. Some have taken punishment to entail the Father punishing the Son on the cross, instead of the more classical approach, which refers to the punishment he bore. Diversity of views arise depending on how one understands different aspects of Christ's work. To begin then with penal substitution and work back to Calvin simply will not do. First, to which version of penal substitution is one referencing? Second, penal substitution as a, quote, theory of atonement is anachronistic to Calvin. In fact, the whole theories of atonement approach is altogether problematic. Referring to different accounts of atonement theology as theories is a rather recent innovation. During the 19th century, German liberal theologians began using the scientific language of theories to pin different aspects of the atonement against one another, as if to show that they were mutually exclusive and viable alternatives to one another. What this approach fails to recognize, however, is that theologians before the 19th century often did not see these explanations as viable alternatives to one another, but as different ways to articulate the wide range of things happening in the death of Jesus. To refer to Abelard's moral influence theory or Anselm's satisfaction theory would be altogether foreign to the reformers. Therefore, when approaching Calvin on the topic, we should remember that he lived in the 16th century and therefore did not hold to one, quote, theory of atonement. Instead, Calvin employed a range of metaphors and descriptors to explain how Christ's work affects salvation. To criticize my verbiage yet again, there remains something to be said about the word atonement. While this word has commonly come to refer to the work of Christ on the cross, this is an imprecise use of it. The word atonement has, in many cases, become synonymous with Christ's work of salvation on the cross. However, Calvin did not have so much of a doctrine of atonement, but rather a doctrine of satisfaction. As such, there is an importance in retrieving the invaluable vocabulary in its historical context that Calvin was familiar with in order to better understand him and his writings on the work of Christ. It has been noted that Calvin consistently used the term satisfactio, or its verbal form satisficere, with reference to the death of Christ, and that it was Calvin's primary doctrinal descriptor for the work of Christ on the cross. At this point, I would like to suggest that speaking of Calvin's doctrine of atonement risks restricting his view of the work of Christ to anachronistic and reductionistic versions of penal substitution. Instead, I propose that it would be more appropriate to speak in terms of Calvin's doctrine of satisfaction. A great deal of theological confusion and misunderstanding has arisen around the word satisfaction. Richard Moeller observed satisfactio has been inappositely rendered into English as atonement. The word atonement is an English word developed in the 16th century. It is a conglomeration of the words at one and meant. It was developed by William Tyndale to translate the Hebrew word kippur into English, and therefore was used most fittingly with the Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16. As such, Calvin never used this word at all, writing in Latin and speaking in French. We should therefore heed Charles Hodge's advice to adhere to old words if we would adhere to old doctrines. Further, atonement is reconciliation. It therefore expresses the effect and not the nature of Christ's work. Reconciliation, or atonement, then is an effect of Christ's work, something accomplished by his work on the cross. However, it has been conventional in the theological community to use atonement to refer to the work that accomplishes reconciliation rather than the reconciliation itself. This inevitably has led to confusion in the terms. Whereas satisfaction has historically referred to the work that accomplishes atonement, the terms reversed, making atonement accomplish satisfaction. Satisfaction, then, is no longer the thing offered, but the thing received. In her book, The End of Satisfaction, Heather Hirschfield indicates that the 16th and early 17th century term satisfaction is understood today almost solely in its appetitive or receptive dimension. Thus, phrases such as God's wrath must be satisfied employs the appetitive dimension of the word satisfaction, which is not found in the writings of John Calvin. With satisfaction being the primary descriptor in Calvin's writing, correctly defining the way Calvin both understood and used it are crucial. Thus, satisfaction in the 16th century, from the Latin satisfacere, can be understood simply as to do enough, in the way someone can render a satisfactory performance. Etymologically, this is sufficiently clear, but Packer similarly defines it. This aspect of righteousness, whereby claims are met, was described in Roman law as satisfaction, which means doing enough to meet the claims that are there. The only problem with this definition is that it limits satisfaction to Roman law, whereas satisfaction is much more of a mundane human experience that transcends cultures. As it locates itself in theology, it refers more specifically to doing enough as compensation to God for sin, an idea directly taken from the work of satisfaction in penance. Johannes Altensteig's 16th century Dictionary of Theological Latin, the standard theological lexicon produced on the eve of the Reformation, defines satisfactio as a voluntary rendering of something equivalent, something else not owed, an outward activity which is laborious or penal, taken on voluntarily to punish sin that one has committed and to placate God's displeasure. And while we cannot say with certainty whether Calvin consulted Altensteig directly, we do know with certainty that his contemporaries did, and that it was an incredibly influential and well-known lexicon by Protestants, Lutherans, and Roman Catholics alike, having a lifespan of over 100 years. Additionally, note how this definition draws on the penitential aspect of satisfaction and not the appetitive dimension. This is consistent with its usage during the medieval period and the Reformation. Calvin likewise employs satisfaction as a work of compensation to remove punishment in a way consistent with Altensteig in Institutes 2, 17:5, where he writes, "For this reason, Paul defines the redemption in Christ's blood as the forgiveness of sins. It is as if he were saying we are justified or acquitted before God because that blood corresponds to satisfaction for us." Another passage agrees with this. In the cross, he cancels the written bond which stood against us. And here's the important line. Paul notes there the payment or compensation that absolves us from guilt. Elsewhere, Calvin also writes, "The satisfaction of Christ is the only one which not only exempts us from guilt and liability to eternal death, but it is the price that buys off temporal punishments also." Calvin's use of satisfaction in this way is not surprising. He could have easily encountered satisfaction as compensation in both his theological studies as well as his legal ones. Thus, satisfaction is something that is done by someone towards God. It is an objective work done to him, not a subjective feeling that he experiences. An example of this confusion obfuscating our reading of Calvin can be found in Paul Furman's translation of John Calvin's instruction in faith. His English translation writes, "God has constituted him priest in order to satisfy the Father for us and to reconcile him through his sacrifice." This translation seems to conflate the two words placation and satisfaction, and sees them as interchangeable. The original Latin does not contain the word satisfactio, but rather placatio, or placation. So nowhere does the idea of satisfaction appear in Calvin's original text. Instead, a theological understanding has influenced the translation of some key text. The loss of historical significance in theological words has caused us to lose the nuance in some of Calvin's writing. Additionally, theologians would distinguish between satisfaction and satisfaction. Whereas satisfaction was the voluntary work assumed by the offender in order to offset future punishment, satisfaction was the punishment itself inflicted by another. If satisfaction is to do enough, then satisfaction is to suffer enough. Altensteg again proves helpful in distinguishing between satisfaction and satisfaction when he writes, "Satisfaction is called voluntary, because if it is exacted by force, it would not be satisfaction, but satisfaction. Therefore, the one who is suffering punishment for sin in hell against his will is not offering satisfaction, but satisfaction. Therefore, even the greatest punishment of hell does not bear away sin, however much that the punishment ordains the man should remain under divine justice." The major differences lie with whether the offense can be removed or not, and who inflicts the penalty. In satisfaction, the cause of offense can be removed through a voluntary penalty assumed by the offender. In satisfaction, the cause of offense was not removed, and therefore an involuntary penalty is inflicted or stipulated by the offended party for failure to make adequate satisfaction. Satisfaction is then the punishment that is inflicted by God on the damned in hell. Additionally, it is a greater punishment inflicted than if one had voluntarily assumed it in satisfaction. At such a point, no soul could do enough to satisfy the demands of divine justice. Reparation cannot be made in satisfaction because nothing can be done to meet the demands of God's justice. In satisfaction, God is the one doing, not the offender. Therefore, satisfaction is inverted in satisfaction because the primary goal is no longer compensation for sins. Therefore, it would be nonsensical to suggest that God could satisfy himself by punishing others, because satisfaction ipso facto is something that is always rendered to him in order to prevent punishment. It can be summarized: redemption involves satisfaction, and damnation involves satisfaction. The primary issue involved in the doctrine of satisfaction for Calvin and his Reformed contemporaries was one of pastoral significance, not apologetic metaphysics. As a minister in Geneva, Calvin was confronted with the fear and anxiety of Christians over issues of penance and purgatory coming from Rome. Reformers and Roman Catholics differed on whether Christ's death fully satisfied for all sins. For the Reformers, Christ's death expiated the guilt or culpa of sin and made full satisfaction for both pre-baptismal and post-baptismal sins. For the Roman Catholics, however, while Christ's death expiates the guilt or culpa of all sins, he only makes satisfaction for the eternal poena or punishment of pre-baptismal sins, leaving the temporal punishment of post-baptismal sins for the Christian to undergo through works of satisfaction in cooperation with Christ. This left many with a lack of assurance in their standing with God. Had they confessed every sin they had ever committed? Had they sinned unknowingly? If so, how could they make the proper satisfaction for those sins? Or did the priest assign an appropriate penalty that God had rendered enough? All of these questions and more would lead to the Reformers' slogan, Solus Christus. Christ alone makes satisfaction for both the guilt and punishment of sin. Contrary to Roman Catholic theology, then, the Reformers taught that the Father was pleased to accept Christ's suffering for both the eternal and temporal punishment of sin, not just original and pre-baptismal. Calvin would have heartily agreed with the Reformer Thomas Wilson in proclaiming adieu to all popish satisfactions. Additionally, another aspect of the relationship of penal substitution to John Calvin revolves around issues of necessity. In modern Christian apologetics, the absolute necessity of the cross as a means of salvation has become a prevailing way to defend why an omnipotent God would die in order to forgive. Most often, this method is rooted in an enthusiasm for charismatic effect, whereas the theological presuppositions it entails warrant further reflection. The assertion that the cross of Jesus Christ was the only possible way a holy and just God could forgive sinful humanity departs from a consensus of the early church tradition, the vast majority of the medieval tradition, Anselm notwithstanding, and most of the reformers who expressed a view on this issue. In reflecting on the historical development surrounding the question of necessity regarding the incarnation and cross, along with the consideration of the theological foils its proponents were reacting to, we are left with the impression that advocates for an absolute necessity of the cross position are pioneers in a new theology that requires further work on their part to prove its validity. The Scottish theologian Donald MacLeod writes, "All the classical theories of atonement presuppose the necessity of the cross." Perhaps MacLeod is correct to some degree, but one should ask, what kind of necessity? In the remainder of this paper, I will consider John Calvin's concept of God's twofold righteousness and commend Calvin's theological framework, which does not allow for an absolute necessity of the incarnation or cross position, because on Calvin's assessment, it does not maintain a high enough view of God's holiness. For the purpose of this paper, I will distinguish between a hypothetical necessity and an absolute necessity of the cross view. The absolute necessity of the cross position can refer to the Anselmian tradition, or the absolute necessity of satisfaction, or the Owenite position, the absolute necessity of retributive punishment. Both of the absolute necessity traditions predicate that given the nature of God, if God wants to save, then he must save by a certain prescribed means, whatever it may be, i.e. satisfaction or punishment. While there are differences and nuances in this tradition, for the purposes of this paper, this overarching definition will adequately apply to both. When referring to the hypothetical necessity position, I am referring to the traditional Augustinian position, whereby given the contingent state of affairs that God will save, God is free with respect to how he can save. If anything is necessary to accomplish the way God chooses to save, it is considered hypothetically necessary, insofar as a means to an end. This position highlights the incarnation's hypothetical necessity in terms of a teleological goal, i.e. humanity's union to Christ and ultimate deification. For God, redemption through the incarnation and cross is more fitting than simple pardon or another type of salvation, because it was through this means that he would lavish his creatures with a salvation that went far beyond anything that was strictly necessary to deal with sin, a salvation truly befitting a magnificent God. For definitions of the different models of necessity, please refer to the handout. Between the years 1554 and 1555, the mature John Calvin preached a series of sermons on the book of Job, wherein he distinguishes between what he calls God's two types of justice. The distinction between God's two types of justice, or two types of righteousness, is one that allows Calvin to operate with a framework wherein all creatures can theoretically be judged to a standard that even a completely innocent being would fail to achieve. The first righteousness, what I will call God's public righteousness, is that righteousness which God has chosen to disclose in his law. The other kind of righteousness, what I will call his secret righteousness, is that which is measured to the standard of God's own righteousness itself. This second type of righteousness is something so perfect and infinite that nothing in the created order could measure up to its rigor. In a sermon on Job chapter 23, Calvin describes God's public righteousness as a type of accommodated justice that God condescends to give us, because he does not demand of us what we owe him, but only what we have the ability to provide. Calvin writes that God closes his eyes to all of that as a father who does not wish to inquire too deeply into his child's life. He clearly sees the faults that are there, but he tolerates them. For Calvin, then, there is a type of pity on God's part for his creatures. Rather than a judge who cannot stray from the letter of the law, Calvin emphasizes a God who is a father and is pleased to see his children give their best effort. What he is not saying is that God is pleased to accept sin because it is the best humanity can offer. Rather, seeing that humanity could never match God's secret righteousness, God accommodates righteousness and tailors it for his children in the law. Susan Schreiner explains, for Calvin, the book of Job teaches that all creaturely perfection, even that of the angels, is accepted by God only insofar as God contents himself with the lower, median, or created justice revealed in the law. The law then is a form of accommodated righteousness on God's part because God does not hold creatures accountable to his own inherent righteousness to the fullest extent that he could. Therefore, while the law may demonstrate God's character, it is not the encapsulation of his own holiness. The concept of God's double righteousness is demonstrated again in Calvin's sermons on the Ten Commandments, where Calvin says that there is a righteousness of God that transcends that of the law. Here is a view of God's holiness that cannot be contained in the covenantal terms given to humanity. The righteousness that is higher than that given by adherence to the law is God's very righteousness, a se. Calvin's reasoning for this is deeply embedded in the creator-creature distinction. Using Job chapter 4, verse 17, Calvin suggests that God could even condemn an unfallen and innocent angel if he were to judge it according to the full rigor of his righteousness, according to his secret righteousness. In the same way, even if a human were to keep the law in all its fullness, they could ultimately be found lacking and thus subject to condemnation if judged according to God's secret righteousness. Calvin writes exactly this in his Institutes, where he says, "Even if someone satisfied the law, not even then could he stand that test of righteousness which surpasses all understanding. Therefore we know that God judges by means of an accommodated justice, according to the public righteousness of the law and not his inherent secret righteousness." Calvin's reasoning for this is that all creaturely righteousness that is attainable is simply a derived righteousness from God. Calvin illustrates this by using 1 Timothy 6:16 to show that God alone is immortal. Thus, angels can only be immortal insofar as they are sustained by the power on high, and insofar as God maintains them. God is rightfully the only producer of life, and thus he possesses life a se. Therefore, all creation only acquires the life that emanates from him. Calvin suggests that in the same way we speak of life, so we should also speak of righteousness. Any righteousness possessed by a creature is therefore derived, and we must not be surprised if angels are found guilty in comparison to God's secret justice. God's righteousness is infinite, while a creature's righteousness, even in a perfectly innocent state, is, quote, small in comparison. I propose that this framework of holiness and righteousness sets the stage for Calvin's adherence to a hypothetical necessity of the cross view, rooting it not simply in a few proof texts, but the very structure of his theology of God. Since the 19th century, it has become a commonplace trope to suggest that Calvin conceded the absolute necessity position in one or two passages, but this betrays his true thoughts on the issue. Claims such as these are misleading and outright wrong. From my count, there are more than a dozen passages spanning across Calvin's corpus where Calvin affirms the traditional Augustinian position. For example, in a sermon on Matthew 26, Calvin says, "In fact, God was well able to rescue us from the unfathomable depths of death in another fashion, but he willed to display the treasures of his infinite goodness when he spared not his only Son." Or in a sermon on Galatians 1, he says, "If God had simply proclaimed our pardon by declaring that he had decided to receive us in mercy despite our unworthiness, that would have been a great thing. Even then, we would never have been able to order sufficient praise for such grace. But God has given us his own Son as a token of his love. Indeed, he has given us himself through his Son and declared himself to be our Father. This so far outshines pardon alone that even if we employed all of our faculties to worship and adore, we could never perfectly praise him for such mercy." Please refer to the handout to see further examples. In addition to the overwhelming evidence from Calvin's pen itself, we see that the absolute necessity position has presuppositions that do not take the holiness of God seriously enough for Calvin's taste. Any type of necessity whereby God must punish or must demand satisfaction, or that is predicated on the sake of upholding his justice or righteousness, assumes that God's public justice encompasses his own inherent righteousness. Advocates of the absolute necessity position claim that God is not bound to some external law outside of himself, but by something found within the divine nature itself. In the book, Pierced for Our Transgressions, Rediscovering the Glory of Penal Substitution, the authors write, "The standard of justice on which basis Christ was punished in our place is not external to God, but intrinsic to him. It is a reflection of his own righteous, holy character." Or similarly, J.I. Packer makes the very bold claim that to Orthodox Calvinism, The law of God is the permanent, unchanging expression of God's eternal and unchangeable holiness and justice. God could not change his law or set it aside in his dealings with men without denying himself. When man sins, therefore, it is not God's nature to save him at the law's expense. Statements such as these are intended to maintain a high regard for God's holiness, stressing that he cannot simply overlook his sin and remain just. The logic runs something like this. Anything that goes against God's nature is sin. God, being a fair God, reveals this standard of his holiness in the law. Therefore, if you do anything against God's nature, you will have violated the law, and you need to either offer satisfaction or God must punish you to remain just. This is a prime example of what S. Mark Haim called the legalism of degenerate Calvinism. That is, that radical ideology that seeks to obligate God within the created order. In questioning this view of absolute necessity, I do not question the conviction that God is supremely holy and just. Many proponents of this view are admirably seeking to uphold these core convictions. However, the mistake of such theology is that it fails to distinguish between ontological and causal necessity. By nature, God is wise and loving. These are both metaphysically necessary insofar as they are expressions of the divine nature. The things then that God wills are necessarily wise and loving by consequence of him being wise and loving. But it does not follow that those things are necessary in and of themselves, for they are only hypothetically necessary insofar as they are decreed by God and chosen according to his will. If God had willed to do something else, then that other thing would be loving and wise because God is by nature loving and wise. So the things that God does are only causally necessary because of the will of God. They are, for all intents and purposes, causally contingent. But Calvin was not so restricted in his theology. He had no theology whereby God was necessitated by his own nature to forgive in a certain way to remain good. John Stott describes God as needing to have a prior condition met before he can forgive, but this is not how Calvin saw it. In fact, Calvin seemed to have a higher view of God's righteousness in mind as he brought forward ideas of God's secret righteousness. For Calvin, God's holiness is so radically other that it cannot be contained in the law. Indeed, no creature could ever stand up to the scrutiny of its rigor. God is pleased to accommodate his righteousness in the law to accept something that is less demanding. John Balsarek helpfully notes that Calvin affirms that it is still the law is properly called perfect so long as it is realized that this perfection is in relation to creatures. Calvin uses this accommodation language in a sermon when he says that the law is not something so perfect and excellent. That then is how there is a more perfect justice than the law. And if God wanted to use that perfect justice, a man would nonetheless remain condemned, even if he had accomplished all that the law contains. It is true our Lord does not use it because he accommodates us on that point and receives and accepts that justice or righteousness, such as he commanded it, as if it were totally perfect. This inevitably means that there are aspects of righteousness that creatures are not going to be held accountable for in judgment. John Balsarek again helpfully points out that the Lord does not attempt to extract such perfection, but indulgently receives and rewards his church's labors, even though they are tarnished. Calvin sees an accommodated righteousness, a divine concession where God is free to accept partial righteousness as he pleases. Creatures, by the very nature of being contingent beings, fail to rise to the standard of God's holiness, yet God does not hold them accountable for it, nor is he obliged by any necessity to punish them. This, in turn, offers a higher view of God's holiness and justice, for there is no way that any creature could rightfully ever attain the type of righteousness that God would be pleased to accept, by very nature of being a contingent created being. Calvin says that even if a man walked as uprightly as possible, he will still find himself guilty before God, so much so that he will be visited with all the afflictions in the world and will have to condemn and humble himself and acknowledge that he still deserves more. On Calvin's view, if there was an ontological necessity in God that made it absolutely necessary for him to mete out retribution or demand satisfaction for every sin, then it would follow that God would fail to accomplish his promises of life to those who follow the law. God's nature would make it so that he could not offer life to anyone who does all of the things outlined in the law, because they are created beings and therefore only have a derived righteousness. Such an understanding means that if God creates, then he must immediately and necessarily condemn his creation as not good, regardless of any obedience offered, even if by a completely innocent being. On Calvin's view, to make such a position work, one would have to compromise God's holiness. But Calvin refuses to do that. If he were here to assess the absolute necessity of punishment position, he would probably say it represents a deficient view of the cross, because among other reasons, it presumes a deficient view of both God's holiness and sovereignty.